It was the night the stars disappeared, and no one saw it coming. Eli knew something was wrong the moment the sky went quiet. The vast, familiar blanket of stars he had always taken for granted vanished, as if the universe itself had pulled the plug. The moon, a bright, ever-watchful guardian of the night, was gone too. And for the first time in his life, Eli felt like he was floating in an empty void, cut off from everything that made sense. He stood outside his small home, the crickets that usually chirped so loudly in the grass now unnervingly silent. The world, it seemed, was holding its breath. His heart thudded louder in his chest than any sound he could hear around him. "There's something wrong tonight," he muttered to himself, though he wasn't sure if he was trying to convince himself or the empty air around him. Eli hadn't always been a man prone to panic or superstition. A product of small-town life, he was methodical, quiet, and trusted the rhythm of routine. The kind of guy who kept to himself, not because he didn't like people, but because he didn't need to fill the space with chatter. His life had always been a predictable cadence. Wake up, work at the local mechanic shop, head home, and spend the evening with a book or a quiet drink on the porch. But tonight was different. Tonight, everything felt off. The town of Rookridge, where Eli had lived his whole life, was quiet on a good day. With a population barely pushing 1,000, it was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business. The houses were spaced far apart, small plots of land stretching between them like forgotten fields of wheat. There was something comforting in the isolation, something that kept people grounded, in their place. But tonight, even Rookridge felt unfamiliar. There was no wind rustling the trees, no distant howl of a coyote. The night had swallowed it all. Eli walked to the edge of his porch and leaned against the railing, his gaze fixed on the empty black sky. He had always loved stargazing. There was something about it that made him feel connected to the vastness of the world, the sense that no matter how small he was, he belonged to something much larger. The stars were his companions, as constant as the sunrise. But now, nothing. His breath hitched in his chest as the thought crossed his mind. What if it never came back? He wasn't the only one who noticed. The entire town seemed to hold its collective breath. Eli's phone buzzed in his pocket, snapping him from his thoughts. It was a text from Jenna, his neighbor, who lived a few doors down. "Are you seeing this?" He quickly typed back, "Yeah, what the hell is happening?" Her reply came seconds later. "I don't know, but it's creeping me out. Everyone's acting weird tonight, like something's off." Eli frowned as he glanced back at the dark sky. The stars weren't just missing, they were absent, as if they'd never existed at all. A chill crept up his spine. He was no conspiracy theorist, no one to jump to conclusions or leap to dark imaginings, but this felt different. Something was coming, and it wasn't the kind of thing you could brush off as a passing storm. Before he could reply to Jenna, a noise caught his attention, a sound, distant but growing nearer, like a rumble beneath the earth. It was faint at first, almost like the hum of a car engine idling miles away, but the more Eli listened, the more it seemed to pulse in his bones. It was unnatural, unsettling. Jenna's next message hit his screen. "I'm going inside. It feels wrong out here." Eli hesitated. He wasn't the kind of person to let fear dictate his actions. He had always been pragmatic. When he was younger, he'd used to stand outside during thunderstorms, staring up at the sky while the lightning cracked above him. His father used to joke that Eli was born with a steady hand, always ready to meet whatever life threw at him. But now, standing in the dark, Eli wasn't sure that bravery would help. With a reluctant sigh, he pulled his jacket tighter around him and stepped off the porch, moving toward the town square. Maybe he could find someone to talk to. Someone who might have an explanation. Someone who could ground him in this growing uncertainty. As he walked through the streets of Rookridge, something felt even more wrong. The houses, once familiar, seemed like hollow shells, their windows dark and empty, their doors closed tight. Even the streetlights, usually flickering to life at dusk, had failed to turn on, leaving the town bathed in a heavy, unnatural darkness. What the hell was happening? His thoughts swirled as he made his way toward the town's small library. Mrs. Harper, the librarian, had lived in Rookridge her entire life. Maybe she had heard something. Maybe she could explain this odd, oppressive silence. When he reached the library, The door was unlocked, which struck him as odd. Mrs. Harper was always meticulous about locking up. He pushed the door open slowly, the hinge creaking in the quiet. The interior was dim, the shelves casting long shadows across the wooden floors. He called out, his voice bouncing off the walls. "Mrs. Harper?" No answer. The air felt thick, like the walls themselves were pressing in on him. Eli stepped inside, his shoes barely making a sound on the floor. As he moved toward the back where the librarian's office was, he passed the large window facing the street. He paused. For a brief moment, he thought he saw movement in the reflection, something dark moving in the corner of his eye. He turned quickly, but the room was empty. "Get a grip, Eli. It's nothing." He took another step, then froze. There, in the middle of the room, was Mrs. Harper. She was standing still, facing the wall, her back to him. "Mrs. Harper?" Eli called again, his voice now laced with unease. She didn't move. His gut twisted as he took a few steps forward. He reached out to tap her on the shoulder, but just before his fingers made contact, she spun around sharply, her eyes wide and wild, her mouth open in a silent scream. Eli stumbled backward, his heart racing. He was paralyzed, unsure of whether he should run or stay. But something in Mrs. Harper's expression, the raw terror etched across her face, told him that running might not make a difference. And then, just as quickly as the panic had come, it receded. Mrs. Harper blinked, and the fear in her eyes seemed to dissolve, replaced with confusion. What happened?" she whispered, her voice shaky. Eli didn't know how to answer. The woman before him wasn't the same calm, collected librarian he'd known for years. There was something off about her. Her skin looked pale, her hair limp, but what unsettled him the most was the way she looked at him as though she hadn't seen him before. "Mrs. Harper, what's going on?" "The stars, they're gone." "The moon too," Eli said, his voice trembling now. She frowned and looked around, as if she didn't understand the question. "What do you mean? The stars? The moon?" "Eli, everything is fine." It wasn't fine. Eli could feel it now, this overwhelming presence that seemed to be growing, suffocating everything in its path. He needed to leave. He needed to get out of here before it was too late. "Something's wrong," Eli whispered again, this time to himself, before turning and walking briskly out of the library. As he stepped back into the streets, the rumbling sound returned, louder this time, as though the earth itself was trembling in anticipation. The night was no longer empty. Something was out there, and it was waiting. If you're curious to see what happens next, subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell so you don't miss a single terrifying moment. The next morning, Eli couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was about to unfold. The events of the night before, the disappearing stars, the chilling encounter with Mrs. Harper, they clung to him like shadows he couldn't escape. His usual routines felt meaningless now, like a mask over a rotting truth. There was no denying it. Something was very wrong, and it wasn't just the disappearance of the stars. He hadn't told anyone about what had happened in the library. What could he say? That Mrs. Harper had been acting strange? Her eyes, wide and full of something indescribable, still haunted him. When he'd walked out of the library, the world outside hadn't felt any less dark. In fact, the silence had deepened, thick and suffocating. The air felt as though it had turned to stone, heavy with something ancient. He'd driven home in a daze, his mind a whirlwind of fear and confusion. Eli wasn't a man of superstition. He was practical, grounded. He trusted his eyes, his instincts, until now. Now, his eyes saw a world that had been altered, warped, and he didn't know what to do with that knowledge. He couldn't stay in his house, cooped up, waiting for the next thing to happen. He needed to understand. He needed answers, something that could explain away the madness creeping in from all sides. So he made a decision. He would find answers. He had to. Eli's first stop was the town's small library, even though he wasn't sure Mrs. Harper would be of much help after their encounter. He needed to speak to someone, anyone, who might know something about what was happening. As he drove through Rookridge, the town looked eerily normal, too normal. The houses, the cracked pavement, the trees that lined the roads, it was all the same. Yet beneath the facade of normality, Eli felt the weight of the night before pressing down on him like a vice. He parked outside the library and hesitated before stepping out of his car. The building loomed ahead, its familiar walls now seeming strange and unsettling. He knew everyone in this town, had known them his whole life, but today everyone felt like a stranger. When he pushed open the door to the library, a bell above it jingled softly. The scent of old paper and dust filled his nostrils as he stepped inside. Mrs. Harper's absence felt even more pronounced now, the silence in the air thick and unwelcoming. Eli walked past the shelves, searching for something, anything that might shed light on the unnatural events of the past 24 hours. It didn't take long before he heard a soft voice calling from the back. "Eli? Is that you?" It was Margaret, the town's elderly historian. Eli had always been fond of Margaret. She had a way of making the past feel alive, her stories of the town's history and the strange superstitions that had shaped it more compelling than any fiction. Margaret had lived in Rookridge longer than anyone else in town, and Eli knew if anyone had answers, it would be her. "Yeah, it's me," Eli called back, walking toward her voice. "I need to talk to you about something. Something strange happened last night." He found Margaret in her usual corner of the library, seated at a small desk, surrounded by dusty books and papers. She looked up at him with a smile, but there was something tired in her eyes, something that made Eli uneasy. "Strange? What sort of strange?" Margaret asked, her voice soft but inquisitive. Eli sat across from her, his hands shaking slightly as he spoke. He told her everything: the disappearance of the stars, the absence of the moon, his encounter with Mrs. Harper, and the overwhelming sense of dread that had settled over Rookridge. Margaret listened quietly, her brow furrowed as she processed his words. When he finished, she sat in silence for a long moment, her gaze fixed on the desk. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "You felt it too, didn't you?" she asked, looking up at him with a solemn expression. "The darkness. Something that's been creeping in." Eli nodded, his throat tightening. "What is it, Margaret? What's going on?" Margaret's eyes flicked to the side, as though she were weighing whether to share the information she knew. Finally, with a heavy sigh, she leaned in closer. "You've heard the stories, haven't you? About the cult, about the old ones that used to live here?" she asked, her voice shaking slightly. Eli nodded slowly, though he didn't believe much of the town's old legends. As a child, he'd listened to the eerie tales, but he'd always chalked them up to old folk stories, nothing more. "They were real," Margaret said softly. "The cult, and what they worshipped, the things they called the Stygian, they were real too." Eli leaned forward, his mind racing. "The Stygian?" he asked. "What are they? What do they have to do with all this?" Margaret took a deep breath, her eyes clouded with something that could only be described as fear. "They were beings from beyond our world, entities of darkness born from the void. They fed on fear, on the terror of those who crossed into their realm. The cult, they tried to summon them, to bring them into this world." Eli's heart began to race. "What happened?" "They were sealed away," Margaret continued, her voice trembling, "by the founders of Rookridge. They used old rituals, wrought powerful magic. But the Stygian never truly left. They're always waiting, watching, for the right moment to return." Eli stood up, his mind whirling. "What does this have to do with the stars? With the moon disappearing?" Margaret's voice dropped to a whisper. "It's a sign, Eli. The stars and the moon, they're the boundary between this world and theirs. When the sky goes dark, when they vanish, it means the boundary is weakening. The Stygian are awakening, and when they rise, the town will fall." Eli stepped back, trying to process what Margaret had said. "But how? How do we stop it?" Margaret shook her head, her eyes full of sorrow. "There's no stopping it. Once the darkness comes, once the Stygian are free, there's nothing left to do but hide." The words hit Eli like a punch to the gut. He wanted to argue, to demand answers, but there was something in Margaret's eyes, a deep, undeniable certainty that told him she wasn't lying. "We're all just waiting now," Margaret said, her voice cracking. "Waiting for the darkness to consume us all." Eli's mind raced as he left the library. The weight of Margaret's words clung to him like a suffocating fog. Hide. How could he hide from something like that? Something that wasn't just a man or a beast, but an ancient force, a terror born of the stars themselves? The rest of the day passed in a blur. Eli tried to go through the motions of normal life, but nothing felt the same. People in town were acting strangely, quieter than usual, as though they were waiting for something terrible to happen. He caught glimpses of their faces in passing, and he saw fear in their eyes, the same fear that gnawed at him from the inside. By nightfall, Eli knew he couldn't stay in Rookridge any longer. But where could he go? Where could anyone go when the sky itself was turning against them? As he sat in his car, staring out at the empty streets of Rookridge, the darkness closed in around him. The Stygian were coming, and there was nowhere left to hide. If you're hooked on this story and want to know what happens next, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell for notifications. The terror is just beginning. The darkness had begun to feel personal to Eli. It was as if it had followed him, whispering in the corners of his mind, lingering in the spaces between the ticking of the clock. The fear he'd felt last night, standing in that library, hearing Margaret's warning, was now a constant companion. He couldn't shake the sense that something terrible was already unfolding, and with each passing moment, the town of Rookridge was slipping further away from the reality he once knew. The stars had vanished, the moon had disappeared, the sky had become an empty canvas, and Eli knew deep in his bones that this wasn't just a bad storm or some freak occurrence. He had lived in Rookridge his entire life, and he had never seen anything like this. It was as though the very fabric of the world was being torn apart at the seams. Eli couldn't wait for the town to fall apart. He couldn't stand to watch everyone else go mad in silence. He needed to know more about the Stygian, the cult that had once tried to summon them, and if there was any shred of hope left to stop the creeping tide of darkness that was devouring the world. He couldn't trust anyone in Rookridge anymore. Not after Margaret's warning. Not after the way the town was starting to change. People were moving differently now, glancing over their shoulders, avoiding eye contact, and acting as though something were lurking just out of sight. Eli knew it was time to leave, but not without answers. If there was even a slim chance that he could stop them, he would take it. He spent the entire day searching for any trace of the cult, any relic that might hold the key to stopping the rise of the Stygian. Margaret's vague references to old rituals and ancient magic had been unsettling, but Eli knew that the truth was buried somewhere in the town's forgotten past. The library had been his first stop, and now he was heading to the one place he hoped would give him some answers, the old church at the edge of town. Rookridge's church had been abandoned for years. The doors had been locked for as long as Eli could remember, the windows boarded up. It was a place of silence and neglect, a crumbling monument to a bygone era. Yet Margaret's words lingered in his mind. The founders of Rookridge sealed them away with powerful magic. It was a long shot, but Eli had nothing else to go on. When he reached the church, the sun had set, casting long shadows across the cracked stone path that led to the entrance. The air was thick, oppressive, the same weight that had settled on Rookridge over the last 24 hours. The stillness was suffocating. Eli's heart beat faster, not from fear of the dark, but from the realization that he was standing on the edge of something vast, something ancient, that he could never have imagined. The church loomed before him, its silhouette jagged against the black sky. The front doors were as old and weathered as the town itself, but they weren't locked. Eli hesitated for a moment, hand resting on the brass handle before pushing the door open. Inside, the air was stale, and the faint smell of mildew hung in the corners. The pews were long abandoned, their cushions rotting with age. Everything about the church seemed to be falling apart, as if time itself was breaking down around him. Eli walked carefully down the center aisle, the floorboards creaking beneath his weight. The altar at the front was shrouded in shadow, the once glorious stained glass windows now faded and cracked. As he passed the pulpit, Eli's eyes were drawn to a small, unmarked door hidden behind a tattered curtain. It was ajar, and beyond it, a narrow staircase led down into the earth. A sense of dread in Eli's chest tightened, but he couldn't stop now. He had to know. With a deep breath, he descended the stairs, the air growing colder with each step. The smell of damp stone and earth grew stronger as he reached the bottom. The basement was a small, dimly lit room, its walls lined with shelves full of dusty, forgotten books. But it wasn't the books that drew his attention. It was the symbols, scratched into the walls, the floor, and even the wooden beams above. They were familiar. Too familiar. Eli's blood ran cold. The symbols were the same as those Mrs. Harper had shown him in the library, the same ones that had made her eyes turn wide with fear. They were the markings of the cult, of the Stygian. He stepped forward, his breath catching in his throat, his eyes scanning the room. There, in the corner of the basement, was a stone altar, its surface covered in dust and age-old cobwebs. On the altar, an old book lay open, its pages yellowed and fragile. The symbols on the pages matched the ones etched into the walls. Eli approached cautiously, kneeling down beside the altar. He reached out and flipped through the pages, his fingers trembling. The language was ancient, unreadable. But the illustrations, they were terrifying. Drawings of black, slithering shapes, monstrous beings rising from the void, figures of people, worshipping, chanting, and in the center of each page, the same dark, swirling mark, the Stygian symbol. A chill crawled up Eli's spine as he turned the pages, his heart pounding. He could feel the presence of something behind him, just out of reach, as though the walls were closing in. The air grew colder still, and for a moment, Eli thought he heard the faintest whisper, a voice calling to him from the shadows. It was a voice he couldn't understand, but it felt ancient and familiar, as if it had been waiting for him all this time. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed through the basement, the sound of something heavy falling. Eli spun around, his heart racing, but there was nothing there. The room was empty, save for the altar and the book. His pulse raced. He had to get out. He had to get away from the church. But as he turned to leave, he saw something that stopped him cold. The door at the top of the stairs had swung shut. And standing in the doorway, blocking his only escape, was a figure. It was Mrs. Harper. But it wasn't the same woman he had seen in the library. This one was different. Her eyes were wide, bloodshot, and her mouth hung open in a twisted, unnatural smile. Her skin had a grayish pallor. Her hair was tangled and wild, and her clothes were torn as though she had been through something unspeakable. "Eli," she rasped, her voice a low, guttural whisper. "You should have listened." He stepped back, his heart in his throat. "Mrs. Harper, what happened to you?" Her smile widened. "The Stygian are here, Eli. They've been waiting for this. You should have stayed in the light. You should have stayed where it was safe." Eli's mind raced. The book, the symbols, it was all connected. The cult, the Stygian, they were awakening. The darkness had been building, and now it had come for them all. Eli turned, his gaze fixed on the book. The words on the pages seemed to twist, as though they were alive, calling to him. He had no choice but to act, to make a decision. The only thing he knew for sure was that he couldn't let the darkness win, not without a fight. With one last look at Mrs. Harper, who now stood motionless, her eyes locked onto his with a terrifying intensity, Eli made a break for the stairs. But as he sprinted toward the door, the room around him seemed to close in. The walls began to pulse with dark energy, the air growing thick and suffocating. The whispers from the shadows grew louder, deafening. The Stygian were here. Eli didn't look back. He couldn't afford to. He had to get out of the church. He had to get out of Rookridge before it was too late. As the door slammed shut behind him, he realized he had no idea what was waiting for him outside. The sky was still dark, the stars and moon long gone. The world was no longer the place he once knew. And as the darkness closed in, Eli understood there was no hiding from the Stygian. If you're enjoying this story and want to see more of these chilling twists, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss an update. And if you've got your own theories or ideas about what's going to happen next, drop them in the comments below. Let's keep the conversation going. Don't forget to like this video if you're ready for more terror and suspense. Thanks for watching, and remember, in this world, when the stars and moon vanish, there's nowhere left to hide. Stay tuned for more nightmares.